in other videos, I've talked about wooden plane, Hawker Hurricane. That's what that is. It's just got a Russian flag on it. They were supplied to Russia. Huge percentages of these two planes were made of wood. Okay, these both the designs of these literally came out of the 1930s. Okay, if these are all analog technology, and there's no computer systems basically inside them to be jammed, EMPs won't hurt them. If they're made along those lines, so they can't be jammed, they can't be controlled with electronic warfare, etc., etc., then the only way to take these guys down is some form of kinetic energy, whether that's a laser, whether that's bullets, missiles, drone impacts, etc. You know, it's going to have to be a physical thing. So we can do what China's doing to the rest of the world now by, they're like a porcupine. They've got multiple rings of different types of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, etc. that can keep our America's aircraft carriers at bay. We have to treat them as their weapons are good. As much as stuff made in China is really shit and probably will fail when tested in real life thingos, like we know all about our made in China products, they're all shit. Okay, we have to assume that they've put all the best of their stuff into their weapons and they mass produce them. Okay, that's the safest bet. So we're not going to get our surface fleets into this area. We're not going to get our manned aircraft into this area because they've checkmated us. They've got that many missile systems and anti-aircraft gun systems that they overlap very heavily. Okay, so one way that we can attack them is long-range standoff weapons. But if we were to buy American-made, British-made, French-made, German-made weapons, they're too expensive. We wouldn't be able to actually use them because we'd run out of them, and none of these little countries here have enough money to buy enough of them. They're too slow to produce, and it just won't happen. So I like to look at what can we get from World War II or any era previous to the technology boom, okay, that can be used, that are cheap, can be produced by any little tiny nation, whether it's little East Timor or these Pacific Island nations, Sri Lanka, you know, Madagascar, you know, it doesn't matter. You don't need heavy industry, you don't need massive amounts of electricity in that. Australia and New Zealand, another prime place that are a long way from here. Okay. So, again, I've mentioned about wooden planes, piston-propelled engines or internal combustion engines instead of jets. Okay, because jet engines require fairly sophisticated turbines and compressors and things like that. They're going to be slow to produce, and they've got to be precise or they're not going to work properly. With the amount of RPMs that they spin at, they have to be balanced well. They need quality bearings and, you know, all that sort of stuff. Where if you go to low technology internal combustion engines, whether they're 2-stroke, whether they're 4-stroke, whether they're diesel, alcohol running engines, it doesn't matter. So what I'm getting at here is, prime example, these two planes here. They both used Merlin V12 engines, designed in the 1930s, 27 litre. They had a 2-speed, or the later ones had 2 and 3-speed superchargers on them. The final ones that were used in like the Lincoln bomber, the Hornet, which replaced the Mosquito, they were making around the 2070 horsepower. They were still a 27 litre engine, basic Merlin V12. They weighed 600 kilos and they were absolutely massive. Okay, so their length, they were very, very, very high tech and quite an engineering feat back in the day. But there's no modern technology in those. So the superchargers on those things were probably rounder than this table. You know, big, heavy things on the front. Now we have things like, anyone who's into drag racing and horsepower and cars know that we have pro chargers and twin turbos on a V configuration engine, right? A turbo this big that weighs about, 18 kilos, 20 kilos max, can produce 2,000 horsepower, okay? And that 2,000 horsepower could easily be put onto something like a 350 small block size engine. So, you go to we'll say the LS family. It's a pretty small, nice, small heads and tappet cover and that, not like the big Chevy big block heads that are massive. So you go to an LS sort of family engine, all aluminium, not pushed to the limits. How much boost does it make to make a 5.7 or a 6 litre, 6.3 litre engine? You're probably pushing it to, maybe 12 pound of boost, maybe 14, potentially 16. Okay, but you don't want to push a plain engine all the way. You just want to make enough power that you can. The thing is, though, the small block LS motor is small. It's light. It's aluminium, so it diffuses heat quite well, or transfers heat quite well. Small and light, and then you can have a supercharger, a turbocharger, or two smaller turbochargers. And we can run that so much more efficiently. We can have like a 6 litre motor instead of a 27 litre motor. So physically, just the size of it alone means that we can make the motor so much smaller. And if you have the same engine in one of these, you could make a small single seat. You could have two of them in something like this. And now the engine can be physically way smaller, like a third of the size. At least, for almost the same equivalent horsepower. But now, because it's only a 5 litre instead of a 27 litre, it's going to make its power so much more efficiently that you don't need all of that fuel, And we can run things like alcohol fuels, can we use diesel with a methanol water injection? Can we use an alcohol engine that runs, hydrogen on demand or something like that, or even an alcohol engine that's got water injection to help cool down the charge so we can run more boost with less detonation, things like that. So we can make these so much more efficient. And these engines here, they didn't even use their exhausts properly, to maximize efficiency, where we can do that these days. We can use the exhaust to make more power, especially from a turbo. So you can make the engine physically smaller. You can make the fuel load so much smaller. So you can start to shrink the size of the plane now. You could have, whether it's one or two pilots, you could then shrink because humans always are going to add a certain size factor to the plane, whoever's inside it. So with you could use some smart technologies in there, definitely, especially if they're not, especially if they're hardwired into the plane and they're not relying on internet or wireless, then they can be safe and they still won't be jammed. And they could also be in Faraday cages inside the plane. So then you could probably get away with not having a navigator. But I will also say that having a navigator on say a medium bomber or something is definitely beneficial. So we can shrink the size of the plane. Now we can also shrink the size of the weapons. Now that guidance systems are so much better, we don't need a 1,000-pound bomb that's going to hit roughly, in the vicinity somewhere and cause some damage. Now we can actually hit what we want to hit. So now we can go a much smaller bomb. So something like a small diameter bomb, You know, something the size of a 155 artillery shell, that's probably enough to do the job that's required to take out a surface vessel, a ship, you know, to take out a plane, to take out, you know, just about anything. We can destroy bridges, we can destroy runways with projectiles that weigh 15 to 20 kilos, where before we had to use 1,000 pound, nearly 500 kilo warheads, or larger. So, and then the way to make those cheap, instead of using solid fuel and all this sort of stuff, and turbines for cruise missiles, why don't we just use something very simple like a pulse jet engine, like the Germans on the V1, runs off alcohol, which again can be grown everywhere, or every single little island nation here can grow hemp, flax, sugarcane, corn, bamboo, etc. And those things can be used to make the planes, to make the fuel, to make the cellulose for the explosives, and they can be made in every little tiny little place where you can grow these different types of things. They run off. We don't need oil to come over from overseas now, because we can produce our own biodiesels and we can produce our ethanol fuels, etc., to power these things. And because these don't need to dogfight with modern jet fighters, all they are is a bomb truck, an observation platform to gather intelligence, and a bomb truck that could carry cruise missiles, pulse jet engine, which is so basic. There's basically no moving parts in them at all, unless you wanted to get extra fancy, but you don't need to. The pulse jet engine will run off alcohol, or run off biodiesel. And then instead of having like the V1 flying bomb from World War II, they could be quite simple. They could just have a small diameter bomb or an artillery size shell in the front of them, so the physical bomb becomes so much smaller, so much lighter, better aerodynamics. You could even make them stealthy. You could even make the outside of the missile itself made from wood, bioplastics, etc., canvas. You know, it's a one-way trip, a one-way ticket to destruction. So they don't need to be anything flash. They just need to be good enough to, through all weather and through the humidity, get to where it needs to go and blows up. Okay, that is one way that we can make them so cheap, and we can out mass produce these bastards. And if they're if they're relatively long range, if we can fly our little bomb trucks to within 1,000 to 2,000 meters of mainland or the South China Sea, and then we fire these mass produced cruise missiles made from natural materials, powered by natural fuels that are renewable. Like, you know, it takes 3 months or maximum 4 month cycle to grow most of these crops. Then you can start growing again, and then, you know, a couple of months of refinement and to finish production. You know, we could just absolutely knock these guys out of the water with production where they could be made, and they're just low technology. You know, and as for a cruise missile made out of a pulse jet, all you need on board really is the fuel. The oxygen comes from the air, that's free. They start getting technical if you try and break the speed of sound, so just keep them like most cruise missiles. Just subsonic, 700, 800 k's an hour or something like that. That's doable, and you can do that with a no valve pulse jet engine. And then you could get them to go so far, then have an ejection charge when they reach a certain point or run out of fuel. The ejection charge is just a small little booster rocket that can fire, either A, climb altitude, or B, just push it to a higher speed, like a small diameter bomb or any of these new guided things now. Wings fly open, and then they can, once they reach a the speed that they need to get to, then they can just glide the rest of the way in. And if you made that warhead out of wood, out of plastic, it could be entirely made out of an explosive plastic. The whole warhead could be a resin, an explosive plastic of some description that doesn't that will have a very, and make it stealthy, so it's got a very low signature, radar signature, and there's basically no heat coming off it. Could be painted in ceramic or whatever, or other heat-proof coatings. So then they're basically virtually invisible to radar, invisible to heat seekers, and they just glide in from a long way away. They could even be drones. You could even have the cruise missile armed with a projector system that just lets out heaps of like little tiny little explosive drones, and they bzzz, and they attack in swarms. And you know, the same way that China's doing it now with their own drone technology, and they just overwhelm our self-defense systems, our 20mm Gatling guns, our anti-aircraft, anti-missile missiles, close-in anti-missile missiles. We do exactly the same thing. We just fire shitloads of ballistic and cruise missiles that are very, very cheap to make. Extremely cheap. And whether they're dumb, we can just absolutely just fill the sky with even dumb ones. Maybe 1 in 10 has the real guidance system in them. The rest of them are just there to act as, you don't know, the enemy won't know which ones are real, which ones aren't. So they'll just have to physically just try and shoot down everything, and we overwhelm their defensive systems, and we just annihilate them with cheap, you know, cheap, farm-grown, very basic kinetic energy, very basic guidance systems delivered by tiny little bomb trucks. Could even be submarines. I was even thinking plastic submarines that are injection molded submarines or whatever, that are small. Okay, they don't need to be big. You could attach to the outsides of them. You could have midget submarines that have just got tubes on the outside, or the weapons themselves are attached to it, and the little submarine goes as far as it wants to, like go in all these shallow waters into all the different little archipelagos around these areas, and then they could either detach, twist their tubes, fire vertical rockets, have cruise missiles on the outsides of them that are kept in canisters to keep them watertight, and they just fire them, and then they disappear, you know. Overwhelm them with that sort of shit, and then we can use after we've overwhelmed them, then the B1s and the B-52s and that, Super Hornets, and you know, can come through with their cruise missiles after that, and then we can put the F-22 Raptors and the F-35s. Then they can come in once we've already overwhelmed them. Then the Navy can come in closer, etc. Anyway, that's just a little bit of daydreaming. From General Concerned Aussie signing out. Just putting it out there.